My name's Nathan, I'm 34, and if there's one thing my family taught me, it's that loyalty has an expiration date, right around the moment money enters the conversation. For context, my dad built a small logistics company from scratch when I was a kid. It started as a single truck and an idea, and over the years it grew into something real, a family business. At least, that's what he always called it when I was spending weekends sweeping the warehouse floors instead of hanging out with friends. My younger brother, Mason, was different. Dad called him the future of the company, even though Mason never worked a single real shift. He was the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. I didn't mind it much at first. Back then, I thought hard work spoke louder than favoritism. I went to college for business, came back home, and poured myself into the company. I redesigned the website, expanded our client base, and negotiated our first international shipping deal. The year after that, we hit record profits. But at every family dinner, when Dad bragged about his sons, he somehow managed to make Mason sound like he was steering the ship while I was just tagging along. Still, I kept my head down. Mason, meanwhile, was busy burning through company funds on marketing experiments that looked suspiciously like weekend parties and luxury car rentals. Whenever I brought it up, Dad would wave it off with, "He's just networking, son. You've got to spend money to make money." By the time I was 28, I was basically running the place. Dad had semi-retired. Mason was exploring new opportunities, and I was handling clients, payroll, and expansion. I didn't complain. Running the business was my dream. I believed if I just proved myself long enough, Dad would finally see me as more than the responsible backup plan. But families like mine don't reward quiet effort. They reward noise, confidence, and the illusion of genius. Mason was good at all three. I'll never forget the first big crack. It was Christmas Eve, 6 years ago. We were at my parents' house, the usual big dinner. My mom was fussing over the turkey. Mason was telling a loud story about some startup he was helping run, and Dad was half listening while scrolling on his phone. When I started talking about a new logistics contract I'd landed with a Fortune 500 client, something that would have doubled our quarterly earnings, Dad barely looked up. Mason interrupted halfway through and said, "That's cute, Nate, but what about innovation? You're just moving boxes." Everyone laughed. Even Mom tried to hide her smile behind her wine glass. That night, I stayed up late in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words. Just moving boxes. That phrase clung to me for years. I'd worked myself to exhaustion for that company, and still, I was just the guy moving boxes. After that, something in me shifted. I started planning. Not revenge, not yet, but a backup. Quietly, I opened a separate LLC under a different name. Something flexible, faceless, designed for privacy. I called it Orion Group. It started as a consulting firm. Within 2 years, it became an investment vehicle. While Dad and Mason were arguing over company trucks and warehouse renovations, I was buying small stakes in tech startups, logistics software firms, and transportation infrastructure. I never flaunted it. No one in my family knew. They didn't ask what I did outside work, and I didn't tell them. Every holiday, Mason's arrogance got a little louder. He'd show up in new suits, bragging about his connections, always hinting that he was going to take the company to the next level. One Easter, he actually said to my face, "Once Dad finally hands over the reins, I'll clean up all that boring old-fashioned stuff you like to do. You're great at keeping the lights on, but I'm a visionary." I smiled, nodded, and made a note in my phone. Never trust him near the books again. 3 months later, one of our major clients called me directly and said, "Hey, Nathan, we've been getting some weird invoices. Says we need to pay to a different account now. Is that legit?" I checked. It wasn't. Mason had rerouted payments to a personal side account for tax efficiency. When I confronted him, he just grinned and said, "Relax, bro. It's temporary. You act like you don't trust me." I told Dad. He sighed and said, "He made a mistake. Don't make it worse by holding a grudge." That was the moment I knew I wasn't part of the family business. I was the safety net. I stayed on for another year, long enough to make sure the contracts and systems I'd built would outlive me. Then, quietly, I sold my shares. Dad didn't even notice until the paperwork hit his desk. When he called, furious, I told him calmly, "I just want to do my own thing. You've got Mason. He's your future, right?" He didn't speak to me for months after that. In the meantime, Orion Group grew. I'd learned enough from my years in logistics to spot undervalued businesses, ones like my dad's. Family run, steady profit, old systems, blind spots. The kind of company that could be bought, modernized, and resold. It was ironic in a way. The same lessons Dad taught me when I was a kid, efficiency, persistence, seeing value where others don't, became the tools I used to build something far beyond him. Fast forward to this past December. Mom called me out of the blue and said, "Nathan, you have to come to Christmas dinner this year. Your father insists." I hesitated. We hadn't spoken properly in ages. But there was something in her voice, nervous excitement. Maybe. That made me curious. I agreed. When I showed up, the house looked the same as ever. The same wreath, the same smell of cinnamon and roasted ham, the same uneasy tension under the surface. Mason greeted me with a smirk and a hug that felt more like a performance. "Didn't think you'd show," he said. "Neither did I replied. Dinner went as usual. Fake smiles, small talk, subtle digs. But toward dessert, Dad stood up, cleared his throat, and said, "Before we end the night, I want to share some news." Everyone quieted. Mom looked emotional. Mason straightened like he was about to be knighted. Dad raised his glass. "After a lot of thought, we've decided it's time to sell the family company." There were gasps and murmurs. My aunt clutched her pearls. Mason grinned. Dad continued, "And before anyone asks, your brother's getting it all." Mason's agreed to stay on and lead the next chapter. Everyone clapped. I didn't. I just smiled, took a slow sip of wine, and asked, "Who handled the deal?" Dad puffed up with pride. "Some private investor named Orion Group. Smart people, apparently." That's when it happened. I couldn't help but laugh. Not loud, not mocking, just a soft, incredulous laugh that stopped the conversation dead. Dad frowned. "What's funny?" I looked at him, then at Mason, then back again. "Dad," I said quietly, setting my glass down, "I am Orion Group." The table went silent. Mason froze mid-bite. My mother's hand trembled, and even the sound of the fireplace seemed to fade. And that's when the real story began. For a moment, nobody said a word. The air was thick, like everyone forgot how to breathe. Dad blinked once, twice, as if trying to process what I'd just said. Mason's fork clattered against his plate, his face twisting from confusion to disbelief to something closer to rage. "You're joking," he said, a forced laugh breaking through his voice. "That's, what, some kind of stunt? You're trying to ruin the moment." I leaned back in my chair. "I wish I was joking." Dad's voice came low and sharp. "Nathan, this isn't funny. You have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do." I turned slightly toward him. The Orion Group made the purchase through a network of holding companies, all fully legitimate. I founded it 6 years ago. Every document you signed, every dotted line, came through me. The silence broke into a dozen murmurs. My aunt whispered something about family betrayal. Mom looked pale. And Mason, he was glaring at me like I'd stolen his birthright. Dad slammed his glass down hard enough to make the table shake. What kind of game are you playing? You think you can humiliate your family for some business trick?" "I didn't trick anyone," I said quietly. "You were the ones who decided I wasn't part of the family business." The words hit him like a slap. His jaw clenched, and for a second, I thought he might actually say he was sorry, or at least realize what had happened. But instead, he exhaled sharply and pointed his finger toward me. "You've always been ungrateful. I built everything we have. If you wanted a piece, you could have asked." I gave a hollow laugh. "Asked? Dad, the last time I asked for anything, you said, and I quote, 'You've already got more than you deserve.'" Mason shot up from his chair. "Enough with the victim act, Nate. You've been jealous since day one. Everyone knows you've got a chip on your shoulder about me and Dad." "Jealous?" I repeated. "You mean jealous of the guy who rerouted client payments into his personal account? Or the guy who calls himself a visionary while living off a company he didn't build?" "Stop it," Mom cried suddenly, standing up. "Both of you. This isn't the time for this." "Actually," I said, my voice calm but steady, "it's exactly the time." The room felt like a pressure cooker about to burst. Everyone was watching, waiting for Dad to take charge, to do what he always did, defend Mason and dismiss me. And right on cue, he turned to me with that familiar look of disappointment. "I don't know what kind of fantasy you're living in, Nathan," he said. "But if you think you can just take something from this family." I didn't take it. I cut in. "You sold it." "Willingly." He froze, eyes narrowing. You manipulated us. I gave you a market offer. You accepted it. Because we didn't know who you were. Mason snapped. Exactly, I said. You didn't care to know. I could see the shift happening. Mason realizing he wasn't inheriting what he thought he was. Dad realizing the empire he built was in someone else's hands. Mom realizing the family dynamic she'd quietly maintained was cracking for good. Dad finally muttered, "This is ridiculous. You're lying. There's no way you could afford something like that." I smiled slightly. You'd be surprised what I can afford when you stop treating me like your unpaid intern. Mom whispered my name, but I didn't look at her. I'd spent too many years craving her sympathy only to watch her do nothing when it mattered. The rest of the dinner disintegrated fast. Mason stormed off, muttering about lawyers and fraud. Dad sat down heavily, rubbing his temples, while Mom kept trying to convince herself this was a misunderstanding. I stayed quiet, letting them spin in circles. Eventually, I stood up, slipped on my coat, and said, "Merry Christmas." But that wasn't the end. 2 days later, I got the first of many phone calls. Mason's voice was furious, panicked. "You can't do this. You can't just take everything Dad built." I didn't take it, I said, keeping my tone even. I bought it. There's a difference. You think you're smart, huh? You think this makes you some kind of winner? No, Mason. It makes me someone who stopped waiting for your approval. He hung up. The next morning, Dad called. His tone was cold, almost businesslike. "We need to talk." At my office. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was that Mason was sitting behind the desk that had been Dad's for as long as I could remember. Dad stood by the window, arms crossed. The moment I stepped inside, Mason said, "You know, you really crossed a line." I didn't sit. "You called me here. What do you want?" Dad turned, his face grim. "I want you to fix this." "Fix what?" "You've humiliated this family," he said. "You've embarrassed us. The deal's made, the papers are filed, so you win, fine. But this has gone too far. You will transfer ownership back to Mason. That's my company, my legacy." I almost laughed, but it came out more like a sigh. "Dad, you sold it. Legally. I have the contracts, the bank confirmations, the filings. You signed everything yourself." He slammed his fist on the desk. "You tricked us." "No," I said softly. "I trusted you'd read before signing." Mason stood, pacing. "You think this is funny? You're trying to ruin our lives over what? Daddy didn't give you enough attention." I looked at him, really looked at him. "You ruined your own life when you started stealing from clients. You think investors didn't notice? You think word didn't spread?" His face went red. "That's a lie." "Is it? I've got the statements." Dad cut in. "Enough. Mason made mistakes, but he's family. And family forgives." That word again. Family. They used it like a shield, a weapon, a leash. "You only preach forgiveness when it benefits Mason," I said. "When I make a mistake, I'm ungrateful. When he does, he's misunderstood. Because he's not vindictive." Dad shouted. "You've been bitter for years. Always sulking because you didn't get the praise you wanted." I felt my throat tighten, not from anger, but from the sheer exhaustion of it. "Do you have any idea what it was like growing up watching you throw away every ounce of respect you had for me? I built half this company's foundation while Mason was off playing visionary. You didn't care. You just kept calling me the reliable one. Like I was some tool you could put back on a shelf when you were done using me." Dad's voice softened slightly. "You're exaggerating." "No, Dad. I'm remembering." For a second, something flickered across his face. Guilt. Maybe. But it disappeared as quickly as it came. Mason crossed his arms, sneering. "So what now? You gonna fire me?" "Not yet," I said, which made him flinch. "But let's just say the board might not see the value in keeping a liability." His jaw tightened. "You wouldn't dare." I turned toward the door. "Merry late Christmas, Mason. Enjoy your final paycheck." When I left, Dad followed me into the hallway. "Nathan, wait." I stopped but didn't turn around. "Don't do this. Whatever grudge you're holding, it's not worth destroying your brother." I looked over my shoulder. "It's not about destroying him, Dad. It's about finally being free from both of you." The look in his eyes wasn't anger this time. It was disbelief, like he never imagined I'd stop playing my role in their little family play. The days that followed were chaos. My phone was flooded with messages from relatives who suddenly remembered my number. "You can't do this to your father," one said. "He made you who you are." Another added, "Mason's devastated. Can't you just give him another chance?" Not one of them asked if I was okay. Meanwhile, Mason started telling anyone who'd listened that I'd stolen the company. He even posted some self-pitying rant online about betrayal from within. I ignored it. Let people talk. The truth had a way of surfacing eventually. But it didn't stop there. Mom called one evening, her voice trembling. "Your father isn't sleeping, Nathan. He feels like you've ripped his heart out. Can't you at least talk to him?" "I tried," I said quietly. "For years." "You're better than this," she whispered. "No, Mom," I replied. "I just finally became what you all thought I wasn't, capable." She started crying softly. I wanted to feel guilty, but I couldn't. I'd spent my whole life being the family's emotional punching bag. I wasn't going back. Still, something about the conversation lingered with me. The way she said, "He feels like you've ripped his heart out." There was truth in it, but there was also irony. They had no idea how many years they'd spent tearing mine apart. By the end of that week, Mason had lawyered up, Dad had gone quiet, and Mom kept calling without saying anything useful. I thought it might all die down, until I got a summons in the mail. They were suing me, Dad and Mason, for fraudulent misrepresentation. And that's when the real tension began. Because if they thought the dinner was the end of the story, they hadn't seen anything yet. The day the lawsuit papers landed on my desk, I didn't get angry. I didn't even feel surprised. I just stared at the thick envelope with our family name typed neatly across the top, Hamilton and Sons Logistics versus Nathaniel Hayes. My name in print next to theirs. It didn't feel real at first, almost like some absurd joke that had gone too far. But the seal at the bottom wasn't a joke. It was official. My own father and brother were taking me to court. I remember sitting there for a while, motionless, listening to the faint hum of the heater in my office. Outside my window, the city skyline glittered, the symbol of everything I'd built after walking away from that suffocating family dynamic. It was supposed to represent independence, freedom. And yet, somehow, I was right back where I'd started, staring at proof that blood didn't mean loyalty. When I told my lawyer, she sighed deeply, like she'd seen this 100 times before. "Let me guess," she said, flipping through the pages. "Family company, inheritance disputes, the golden child feels wronged." I couldn't even muster a laugh. "Something like that." She nodded slowly. "They're claiming you used deceptive practices to acquire the business. They want the court to void the sale and revert ownership to them." "In other words," I said, "they're saying I tricked them into signing a deal they didn't understand." Her lips tightened. "Which, given your father's experience, will be hard to prove. But make no mistake, this isn't about business. It's personal." Personal. That word rang in my ears for days. A week later, the first hearing was scheduled. The night before, I got a text from an unknown number. It was Mason. "Hope your little empire was worth it. You're going to lose everything." No greeting. No punctuation beyond that. Just venom. I should have ignored it, but part of me, the part that still hoped there was something human left in him, couldn't help replying. "This isn't the way, Mason. You could have talked to me." He read it instantly. No response. The next morning in court, I realized why. Mason was already there, standing beside Dad and their lawyer. He looked smug, confident, perfectly polished in a tailored suit that didn't fit his expression, a mix of triumph and cruelty. Dad sat rigid, eyes forward, refusing to look at me. When he finally did, it wasn't the look of a man wronged. It was worse. It was disappointment. As the hearing began, their lawyer painted me as a manipulative opportunist. "Mr. Hayes deliberately concealed his identity behind corporate entities," she said, her tone measured and sharp. "He exploited his family's trust and orchestrated a sale under false pretenses. This was not a legitimate transaction. It was a betrayal." I didn't look at her. I looked at them. Dad nodded slowly, almost theatrically, as if every word was a truth he'd carried in silence for years. Mason sat back, arms crossed, soaking up every accusation like it was justice finally served. When it was my turn, my lawyer stood and presented our evidence. Clear documentation showing I'd followed every legal process, every disclosure requirement. Nothing was hidden. The Orion Group structure was public record. They'd simply never bothered to look. Still, Dad shook his head as though I were lying. When the judge asked if he'd read the documents before signing, Dad's response was chilling in its calmness. I trusted my son. He said it like an indictment. Like trust was a weapon I'd used against him. Something cracked inside me then. Something I'd been holding together for years. This wasn't business anymore. It wasn't about money or contracts or paperwork. It was about rewriting history to justify his own pride. After the session, I walked out of the courtroom and found Mom waiting in the hallway. She looked older, smaller somehow. "Nathan," she whispered, reaching for my arm. I stepped back instinctively. "You knew?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Your father. He thought it was the only way to make you understand what you'd done. He said you humiliated him in front of everyone. By buying the company he sold willingly?" "Nathan, please." She lowered her voice, glancing around. "He's hurting. You both are. Just stop this before it goes too far." "Too far," I repeated, my voice low. "He's suing his own son." "You sued him first," she blurted out. I froze. "What?" Her hand trembled as she reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of printouts. "Your father showed me. Those letters from your lawyer, the demand for documents, the notices. He said you started this." It took me a second to process what she meant. Then it hit me like a punch to the chest. Dad had rewritten the entire timeline, told her I'd been the one who launched legal action first, forcing him to respond defensively. "Mom," I said slowly, "that's not true. He's lying to you." Her lips quivered. "He wouldn't lie about something like this." I took a step closer. "He's lying because he can't stand not being in control. He can't handle that his second son, the one he ignored, is finally in charge." She shook her head, whispering, "You sound just like him." That hurt more than I expected. I left without another word. The following weeks were chaos. Every time I opened my email, there was another attack, new legal claims, new evidence, new attempts to drag my name through the mud. Mason had started feeding stories to local business blogs, painting me as the disloyal son who betrayed his dying father's legacy. The comments were vicious. People who'd never met me called me a snake, a fraud, a sociopath. And then came the leak. It started small, a post on a local business forum claiming Orion Group had been involved in questionable overseas investments. Within hours, it spread. By the next day, a national outlet picked it up. Private equity firm Orion Group under scrutiny for possible shell dealings. The source? Anonymous. But the documents attached? Internal files from Orion. Files only Mason could have had access to through his old company email, which I'd apparently overlooked revoking. I called him that night. He answered on the third ring. "Was it you?" I asked. He didn't deny it. "You brought this on yourself. Those files were confidential. Mason, you could have ruined hundreds of people's jobs. Don't act like you care about anyone but yourself. You wanted control? Fine. Let's see how it feels when everything you built starts falling apart." "Mason." He hung up. 2 days later, Orion Group's investors started calling. Some wanted reassurance. Others wanted out. My lawyer called it a controlled crisis. I called it betrayal on a level I didn't even think he was capable of. And then, the final blow came. I was in my office late one night when I got an email from a bank executive I'd known for years. "Nathan, I thought you should know. Your father and brother approached us this morning about securing a loan to buy Orion Group's debt position. They plan to force you out by acquiring your own company's obligations." I sat there in stunned silence. They weren't just trying to take back the old company. They were trying to own me again. The irony was brutal. For years, I'd been the one cleaning up Mason's financial messes, paying off loans, smoothing over debts, protecting the family name. And now, they were weaponizing that very world against me. That night, I drove to my parents' house. I don't even remember the full drive, just the blur of headlights and cold winter air. When I arrived, I saw Mason's car in the driveway. I walked straight in. Mom gasped when she saw me. "Nathan, you can't just." "Where's Dad?" I asked. "In his study." I didn't knock. I pushed the door open. Dad was sitting at his desk, flipping through financial papers. Mason leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Well," Mason said with a smirk, "look who finally decided to come home." I ignored him. "Alone, Dad? You're actually trying to buy Orion's debt." He looked up, calm as ever. "It's just business, son." "No," I said, stepping closer. "It's obsession. You can't stand not being in control, so you'll burn everything to the ground just to feel powerful again." He set his pen down slowly. "Watch your tone." Mason chuckled. "He's losing it." I turned on him. "You leaked confidential documents, Mason. That's not ambition. That's sabotage." Dad cut in sharply. "Enough." Mason did what I asked him to do. The words hit me like ice water. I blinked. "You asked him?" Dad stood up. He's my son. He's protecting what's rightfully ours. For a moment, all I could do was stare. Everything made sense in an instant. The leaks, the press stories, the anonymous sources. It wasn't Mason acting out of desperation. It was Dad orchestrating it all. You used him, I said quietly. You turned him into your weapon. Dad's face hardened. I taught him to fight for what's his. Something you clearly never learned. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. You taught him to cheat, lie, and destroy everything in his way. Congratulations, Dad. You finally built your legacy. For a split second, he hesitated. Then he said it. The line that broke whatever was left of our relationship. You were never supposed to be the heir. You were supposed to help the heir. Mason smiled faintly, like he'd been waiting his whole life to hear that said aloud. And in that moment, something inside me went cold. I looked at them, my father, my brother, and realized I wasn't part of their family anymore. Maybe I never had been. So I said nothing. I just turned and walked out, leaving them standing there in their carefully curated empire of pride and lies. But as I got in my car and looked back at that house, I made myself a promise. If they wanted war, I'd give them one. The next few weeks felt like someone had taken the edges off my life and left me to slide slowly into nothing. It wasn't a dramatic fall. No one shoved me off a cliff, but the erosion was steady and remorseless. Investors called in favors and promises. Board members who'd once praised Orion's strategic vision suddenly found other priorities. The press that had been curious turned hostile. My inbox filled with terse emails, requests for emergency calls, demands for explanations, notices of intent to withdraw funds. A name I'd worked years to make respectable was suddenly smeared across rooftops with insinuations and innuendo I didn't have time to correct. Worst of all, the lawsuit didn't wait. The court moved fast on motions, and the legal fees mounted like a tide. I read one bill and felt my stomach drop. The number could buy a small house. I sold things I'd never thought I would. The watch my grandfather had given me when I signed my first lease, the guitar I kept when I wanted to pretend I had time for hobbies, the motorcycle I'd used for late-night drives when I needed to think. Each sale was a tiny severing. It was practical, of course. Lawyers need money. Businesses need liquidity, but it also felt like trimming away parts of myself that had been useful once, even if only to remember a different life. Friends became awkward. Some didn't pick up their phones for days. Others called with thinly veiled curiosity. Are you okay? Heard things. And I could hear the judgment hiding behind concern. Mom's calls came in fits, pleading, guilt-tinged, then surprisingly pragmatic. You should settle, she said at one point, voice small. It'll be over. The implication was clear. Stop embarrassing the family. Save the reputation. I understood her fear. Being publicly at war with your parents is a bad headline for anyone. But I'd stopped honoring their version of family the moment it became a system that punished me for trying to be more than their accessory. There were nights when I'd sit at my kitchen counter with a half-empty cup of coffee and scroll through message boards where strangers argued about me like I was a character on a show. They dissected my motives, decided my sins, suggested humiliations they would like to see. The anonymity made their cruelty efficient. Somewhere between the comments and the bills, I felt myself losing the oxygen of normal life. Sleep became a suggestion, not a fact. I'd wake at 3 a.m., watch the city lights, and try to remember who I was before the lawsuits and the leaks, and the headline writers gave me a label I didn't want. Then the more practical problems started. A key investor demanded additional collateral after the leak. Standard contingency clauses suddenly activated. Vendors sent polite but firm letters asking for assurances. Software licenses were put on hold pending review. Small things, individually, that together started to choke operations. My inbox filled with urgent and final notice. I began to feel the old familiar churn of imposter syndrome. Only this time, it wasn't about capability. It was about betrayal. Families are supposed to have your back, right? If not back, then at least a baseline of decency. Apparently not. The emotional weight of it all landed hardest when Mom called me after a hearing and couldn't get through the sentence before breaking down. He's not eating, she said of Dad. He won't answer the phone. Mason's living at the office. They say they're doing it for the family. The performative grief made my skin crawl. It was a pattern. Manufacture outrage, seek public sympathy, rally the chorus. I tried to imagine which was worse, the the calculated cruelty, or the blind, self-justifying righteousness. And yet, in the quiet of those nights, something else happened. The first month of the lawsuit stripped away illusions. It showed me where my systems were fragile: an overlooked email account here, a lack of multi-factor authentication there, too much faith in goodwill when I should have insisted on concrete processes. Those were painful admissions because they meant I'd failed myself as much as anyone else. But they were also useful. Adversity has a way of making you hyper-aware of what actually matters. I started cleaning up the technical mess. I changed passwords, locked down accounts, and hired a cybersecurity consultant to sweep Orion's servers. I spent hours on calls with auditors, tracing the leak back to the access logs. I learned how long it takes to get a bank to respond to a fraud allegation and how many forms you need to prove a transfer was illicit. Every small victory, seeing a server log that proved an unauthorized download, watching an email trail that contradicted a smear piece, felt like a match struck in a dark room. But the matches were finite, and the dark was broad. Personal life diminished. Dates evaporated into rescheduled coffees. Dinners with friends became short check-ins. I barely cared that I was missing out on things I would once have prioritized. There were practical reasons. I couldn't afford social indulgences when the legal bills were stacking, but there was also a grayness that made participation feel performative. Who was I to laugh at a joke when my brother and father were trying to bankrupt me? One night, when insomnia had me pacing the apartment, I pulled out an old notebook from a drawer. It was the one I kept when I first started Orion Group, a ragged little thing filled with early ideas, scrawled strategies, and hopeful projections. Flicking through it felt like visiting a younger version of myself who'd thought the future was a map you could draw if you were persistent enough. The pages smelled faintly of coffee and my old optimism. I laughed, briefly, at my own naivety. Then I started making new notes in the margins: contingency plans, a list of contacts who still owed me favors, possible emergency funding sources that weren't tied to banks. For the first time in months, it felt like I was regaining agency. I reached out quietly to people I trusted, former partners, a couple of reliable angels who'd backed one of my first acquisitions, and Anna, a CFO I'd worked with years ago who'd always been blunt but loyal. Anna answered on the second ring. "You okay?" she asked, no pretense. I told her the bare facts. She didn't ask for details. She asked for dates, numbers, and access. Within 48 hours, she'd pulled together a small team: a forensic accountant, a crisis PR person experienced in corporate family fires, and a litigation support analyst. They worked fast and didn't waste words. If you want to rebuild while the noise is loud, hire people who are allergic to drama and addicted to spreadsheets. We also started quietly documenting everything that could help my defense and eventually my counteroffensive. Contracts, internal memos, time-stamped emails, server logs, old invoices. Every scrap of paper and digital breadcrumb became an artifact. The process was methodical and oddly calming. Where my family had relied on theatrics and emotional manipulation, I would rely on evidence and patience. It wasn't sexy. There were no rallies, no dramatic press statements, just quiet, grinding work that felt a lot like what I'd done to build Orion in the first place. There were moments of doubt. Times I would catch myself imagining Dad's face on the stand, or Mason's smug look melting away in court, and then feel foolish for wanting that kind of spectacle. I didn't want to humiliate them for the sake of a headline. I wanted to prevent them from weaponizing the truth again, protect the employees whose livelihoods were on the line, the investors who trusted me, and the clients who needed steady logistics and honest service. My resentment toward them simmered with a pragmatic heat. It became a tool rather than a poison. Then there was the quietest, sharpest pain: the idea that our parents' home, the kitchen where the Christmas toast had been made, the living room where my childhood had played out, had become ground zero for this war. I drove by the house once late at night, watched warm lights behind the curtains, and felt the distance between us like a physical thing. I thought of every family dinner where I'd swallowed a dig or laughed at an insult to keep peace, and the taste of those swallowed moments still lingered. At my lowest, there were nights I considered walking away entirely. Liquidate Orion, pay the lawyers, settle quietly, reclaim my life outside of their orbit. It would mean defeat in the eyes of anyone who'd never felt the smothering need for approval I had for so long. But there was dignity in choosing your own life over proving a point. I pictured a slower life, consulting for small businesses, teaching a class now and then, sleeping through the night without a ticker of court dates. Those visions were seductive. But then a different thought lodged itself in my head. Retreat felt a lot like surrendering the only thing I'd made for myself. I'd built Orion as a refuge and a statement. It was not merely a company. It was proof that I could create value without being validated by someone else. If I folded it to spare their feelings and save face for a family that had repeatedly used me, what would I be proving? That the comfortable status quo of being the reliable child was better than the messy work of autonomy? I'd spent too long letting them define me. That stopped being acceptable. So I kept going. Quietly, methodically, painfully. I negotiated payment plans for legal fees, reopened old lines of credit, and spoke with sympathetic investors one-on-one. I apologized to no one, because there was nothing to apologize for. Only to be clear, to be prepared, and to be strategic. Work became refuge. The daily grind of managing crises felt less like survival and more like focus. When my hands were busy solving problems, my chest didn't feel as tight. And then, just when I started to feel the first brittle shoots of recovery, Anna sent me a file she'd found while combing through the company's historical records. It was a scanned batch of old memos and invoices, sticky with the smell of years. Most of it was boring administrative stuff, but one document had a handwritten note in the margin. The handwriting looked familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. It was Dad's, neat and decisive. The note referenced an internal transfer, one that didn't add up to anything on the formal books. There was an account number, a name I didn't recognize, and a date that coincided with a large payment the company had made years earlier. I stared at the page until the letters blurred. If that transfer was what it looked like, it was the smoking gun nobody had expected, a hidden trail that connected my family's finances to a web of third parties, one that could explain a lot of the sudden moves they were making now. If it was real, it wasn't just money, it was motive. If Dad had been moving funds through shadow channels all along, then his righteous outrage at me would look very different. If Mason had been playing at being a visionary while siphoning cash, then his indignation would look like projection. Anna's message popped up in my inbox. You need to see this. Call me now. My phone felt heavy in my hand. For a second, just a second, I imagined walking back into that family house, document in hand, and turning the accusation onto them. I imagined their faces. I imagined the shock. I imagined the way it would shift everything. Then I realized I didn't want a moment of triumph. I wanted clarity and justice and safety for the people who depended on Orion. I wanted to be the kind of person who solved problems not by spectacle, but by evidence. I clicked the number for Anna and waited. Her voice came through, steady and clipped. We may have something, she said, but we need more. And you can't go to them with only this. If we proceed, we do it with full forensic backup. We don't let them gaslight us again. My heart hammered. The plan was forming in the quiet like frost on a window, slow, inevitable, precise. Okay, I said. Do it. As I hung up, I looked at the handwritten note again. The ink had faded in places, but the edges of the paper were clear. It felt small and fragile, but it felt like the first honest thing I'd seen from them in months. I folded it carefully, put it in my pocket, and for the first time in a long while, didn't feel entirely empty. Then my phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed. I hesitated, thumb hovering. The caller ID didn't mean anything to me, yet. But the message they left an hour later would change everything in a way I didn't expect. The voicemail came late that night, a voice I hadn't heard in years. It belonged to an old mentor, a retired logistics executive named Raymond who'd once told me, "Power isn't about how much you own, it's about how quietly you can move the pieces." His message was short, gravelly. Heard about your family mess. Call me back. I've got something you'll want to see. When I returned his call, he got straight to it. Your father's been shopping his story around to private investors. He's trying to form a coalition to force a buyout of Orion. Problem is, he's lying about the company's numbers. My heart picked up. What do you mean? I've seen the deck he's been circulating, Raymond said. He's inflating Orion's liabilities and pretending he's rescuing a sinking ship. But what he's really doing is setting up an insider acquisition that benefits a holding company, one registered in your brother's name. There it was, the next layer of the scheme. Mason and Dad hadn't just tried to destroy me out of spite. They were trying to own Orion through deceit. They wanted to crush me, then rebuild on the ashes. That night, I opened every file Anna and her team had been analyzing. I remembered the handwritten note from my father, the hidden transfer, the offshore account. It was time to follow the trail completely. Over the next 3 weeks, we tracked payments, traced shell corporations, and built a picture of how deep the rot went. Every transfer had a signature. Every shadow account had a paper trail. And at the center of it all, my father. But revenge, I decided, wouldn't come through shouting or spectacle. It would come through precision, through truth. I started small. I called up old contacts in the industry, executives who respected me, people who'd quietly watched my downfall with discomfort. I didn't ask for help. I just told them the story, calmly, professionally, the kind of honesty that makes powerful people lean in. A few of them sent quiet words of support. Others offered something better, information. Then came the first pivot. We launched a new Orion initiative, a logistics optimization platform we'd been developing in the background. It used machine learning to predict shipping delays and automate resource allocation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was revolutionary for mid-tier distributors. The timing was perfect. Investors looking for scandal-free innovation started circling again. By spring, Orion was stabilizing. The press stopped writing hit pieces when new partnerships started appearing in headlines instead. Orion Group introduces predictive logistics AI. Mid-sized firms join Orion platform in record numbers. The same publications that had called me a fraud were now calling me a visionary. I didn't bask in it. I just kept moving the pieces, quietly. Meanwhile, Anna and the forensic team compiled a report so airtight it could choke a courtroom. We found that my father had siphoned funds from company assets long before the sale, effectively hollowing out portions of the business to create a false valuation. Mason had benefited directly from those accounts. If exposed, they wouldn't just lose the lawsuit, they'd face criminal charges. We didn't go to court right away. I wanted something cleaner, something poetic. So I called their lawyer. Calmly, professionally. Here's the situation, I told her. Your clients have filed a fraudulent claim built on doctored financials. I have the documentation to prove it. I could go to the district attorney and let this become a very public criminal case. But I'd rather settle quietly. She hesitated. What kind of settlement? The lawsuit is dropped. The defamatory statements are retracted. And they issue a formal letter acknowledging that Orion Group's acquisition was entirely legitimate. And if they refuse, then I give the evidence to the press. 2 days of silence followed. Then a response. We'd like to discuss terms. I didn't attend the meeting in person. Anna went in my place. She said the moment she laid the files on the table, Dad's lawyer turned gray. My father, apparently, said nothing for most of it, just stared at the evidence, realizing too late that his signature appeared on half the damning documents. Mason tried to interrupt several times, claiming it was out of context, but the numbers didn't care. The ink didn't lie. They caved. The lawsuit was quietly withdrawn. Publicly, they blamed a misunderstanding. But privately, they knew they'd lost everything. For most people, that would have been the end. But I wasn't most people. Because revenge, to me, wasn't about payback, it was about balance. They had tried to ruin my name, my company, my livelihood. They needed to feel what it was like to watch the world they built tilt away from them. So I executed phase 2. Remember that offshore account we found in Dad's handwriting? It wasn't dormant. It was active, quietly holding millions in undeclared assets. Funds he'd hidden to avoid taxes, to prop up Mason's reckless spending. I sent the documentation, not to the police, but to the IRS's anonymous whistleblower program, along with a detailed audit trail. It took 6 weeks. Then one morning, I got a short, satisfying notification, case under federal review. I didn't need to see what happened next to know the outcome. Auditors don't take kindly to undeclared offshore funds. By the time the storm hit, I was already preparing my next move, expanding Orion internationally with 2 new investors who admired how I'd handled the crisis. My reputation, once shredded, was reborn as something sharper, resilient. And then, one late afternoon, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in months. Mom. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice was quiet. They froze your father's accounts. I said nothing. He's furious, she continued, voice trembling. He says you're destroying the family. The family destroyed itself, I said. There was a long pause. He's selling the house, she whispered. Everything's falling apart. I closed my eyes. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I just felt tired. Mom, I said softly, you can stay out of it. You don't have to pick sides. I already did, Nathan, she said, and hung up. That night, I went for a walk through the city. The spring air was cool, clean, almost cinematic. I passed by a bar where businessmen were laughing over expensive whiskey, by a woman closing her flower shop, by a kid skating down the sidewalk. Normal life, moving on. At one point, I stopped at a red light, looked up, and saw a billboard. Orion Group, redefining logistics through integrity. Anna had approved the tagline. I hadn't realized it had gone live yet. I smiled faintly. Integrity. The irony wasn't lost on me. But it wasn't about irony anymore. It was about closure. The next day, I attended one final board meeting, our quarterly review. The numbers were better than expected. Growth was steady, investors were happy, and the lawsuits were officially over. As the meeting ended, one of the board members, a sharp-eyed woman named Denise, leaned over and said, "You know, most people would have folded after what happened to you." "I guess I'm not most people," I said. She smiled. "No, you're not." Later that night, Anna sent me a short email. They've settled with the IRS. Penalties and back taxes. Mason's accounts have been seized. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. There was no gloating, no champagne. Just silence. The kind that follows a long, slow exhale after years of holding your breath. The revenge was complete, even if no one called it that out loud. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't gloated. I hadn't humiliated them publicly. I'd simply done what they never believed I could do. Outthink them. And yet, I knew something else. People like my father didn't go quietly. Mason certainly wouldn't. There would be another ripple, another consequence. I could feel it in my bones. The story wasn't over yet. Because just as I was beginning to rebuild my life from the ashes, a letter arrived at my office, hand-delivered and signed. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting. No closing line. Just 7 words, written in my father's sharp, unmistakable handwriting. "You don't understand what you've started, son." The letter sat on my desk for nearly an hour before I opened it again. Those 7 words, "You don't understand what you've started, son," were meant to intimidate me. That was always my father's language. Authority disguised as concern, control wrapped in paternal tone. But this time, it didn't work. Because for the first time in my life, I truly did understand what I'd started. By the time his letter reached me, the damage was already irreversible. The IRS investigation had cracked open more than a hidden account. It exposed a decade of financial deceit. Transfers disguised as consulting expenses, cash withdrawals from fake vendors, and offshore entities listed under variations of Mason's name. Every transaction had a digital fingerprint, and every fingerprint led back to them. The investigation didn't stay private for long. A local business journal broke the story first. Former Hamilton and Son CEO under federal investigation for financial misconduct. Within a week, every major financial outlet had picked it up. The Hamilton name, once synonymous with family values in business, had become a cautionary tale about nepotism and greed. I didn't have to make a single statement. The truth spoke for itself. Dad tried to go on the defensive. He hired a PR firm, issued vague denials, and blamed malicious actors within the company for falsifying records. But the investigators didn't care about press releases. They cared about signatures, transactions, and patterns. Every audit confirmed what we already knew. Dad and Mason had built a private slush fund from company profits, money they'd used to fund personal luxuries and fake ventures. When the subpoenas landed, Mason panicked first. His calls came in waves, angry voicemails, desperate texts, emails full of contradictions. "You can fix this, Nate. They're going after Dad too. You don't want that. You think you're the hero? You'll regret this." I ignored them all. One morning, my lawyer called to tell me Mason's accounts had been frozen and that he was facing an official indictment for tax evasion and wire fraud. I didn't feel joy, just a deep, heavy calm. He'd always believed he could outrun consequences with charm and manipulation. Now, he couldn't even pay his own legal fees. Dad, though, he was different. He didn't panic. He fought. He'd built his whole identity on being untouchable, and even as the walls closed in, he refused to admit defeat. He sold the family house to cover mounting penalties, liquidated assets, and tried to negotiate a plea deal that would spare Mason from prison. But pride has a price. And he couldn't stop talking long enough to save himself. The prosecutors discovered new inconsistencies in his testimony, lies told under oath, that turned a tax case into a potential perjury charge. I found out about the plea bargain from my lawyer. Dad would serve 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of probation. Mason's sentence would be lighter, community service and financial restrictions, because he'd agreed to cooperate. It should have been satisfying. Justice, in its rawest form. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like watching a building you grew up in crumble. Necessary, but heartbreaking. A few months later, Mom called me. I hadn't heard from her since the settlement. She didn't start with small talk. He's going away next week, she said quietly. I knew what she meant. There was a long silence. I could hear the hum of her refrigerator, the faint sound of her breathing. She sounded older, worn thin by years of trying to hold together a family built on denial. I'm sorry, she finally said, for not believing you, for not seeing it sooner. It's okay, I said softly, though we both knew it wasn't. She hesitated. He wants to see you before he goes. I closed my eyes. Why? I think he just wants to talk. The old version of me would have gone. The part that still wanted to fix things, to prove I wasn't the villain in their story. But that version of me didn't exist anymore. Tell him I wish him peace, I said finally. But I've said everything I needed to. She didn't argue. She just whispered, take care of yourself, and hung up. When the day of his sentencing came, I didn't watch it live. I was in a board meeting, finalizing Orion's expansion into Europe. But later that evening, I saw the headline scroll across the financial ticker, Hamilton sentenced in corporate fraud case. The photo that accompanied it hit me harder than I expected. My father, the once proud patriarch, in a dark suit that looked a size too big, walking up the courthouse steps. He wasn't angry or defiant. He just looked tired. In that moment, I realized something important. I hadn't destroyed him. He destroyed himself. All I did was stop pretending otherwise. Mason tried to reinvent himself after the scandal. He started a podcast, of all things, about redemption and rebuilding. I listened to one episode out of curiosity. It was full of self-pity and half-truths. He talked about betrayal, about people who pretend to help you but really want to take your place. Not once did he mention responsibility. I turned it off halfway through. Some people never learn. Months passed. The noise faded. Orion thrived. Investors who'd once walked away came back with renewed faith. We launched new initiatives, hired more people, and expanded into markets I'd only dreamed of before. The company, once the tool my family used to measure my worth, had become the proof of what I could build without them. Still, there were quiet moments when I thought about what it all cost. Family dinners that would never happen again. Holidays that would always feel incomplete. A childhood home now owned by strangers. Success doesn't fill those spaces, it just builds around them. One evening, after a long day at work, I drove out to the coast. There's a cliffside spot I like, overlooking the ocean, where the air feels clean and honest. I parked, stepped out, and let the wind hit my face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of expectation pressing on me. My phone buzzed, a text from Anna. Congrats on the London deal. You did it, Nate. I smiled. Simple words, but they meant everything. I looked out at the waves and thought about that Christmas dinner. The laughter, the smug toast, the moment Dad said Mason would get everything. I remembered the silence after I'd said, Dad, I am Orion Group. Everything that followed, the lawsuits, the lies, the heartbreak, had started with that one moment of truth. And as painful as it was, I wouldn't take it back. Because in tearing everything down, I'd built something stronger. Not just a company, but a life on my own terms. A few weeks later, I got one last letter. This time, it wasn't threatening. It was from Dad, written from prison. Nathan, I spent a lot of years thinking success meant control. That keeping things in the family was the same as protecting them. I see now that I wasn't protecting anyone. I was suffocating them. You didn't betray us. You freed yourself from me. I can't undo what I've done, but I wanted you to know I'm proud of what you built. Proud of you. Your father. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and set it in my drawer. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say. 6 months later, Orion Group hosted its annual investor gala in a downtown ballroom. Cameras flashed, champagne glasses clinked, and somewhere between the speeches and applause, I found a quiet moment to step aside. Anna approached, holding 2 glasses. For survival, she said. I raised mine. No, I said. For clarity. We clinked glasses. And as I looked out over the city skyline, my city now, not his, I felt something settle in my chest. Not vengeance. Not victory. Just peace. Because in the end, my father was right about one thing. I hadn't understood what I'd started. Not until now. What I'd started wasn't revenge. It was liberation. And I'd finally won it.